Okay, so picture this. The year is 1857. A massive, violent revolt just explodes across northern India, and it shakes the British Empire to its absolute core. Now, you might think something this huge must have been a sudden event, right? But it wasn't. This was more like a fever breaking after 100 years of sickness. So let's dig into how a full century of colonial rule pushed an entire subcontinent right to the very edge. This timeline really sets the stage for us. It all kicks off in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. That's the moment the British East India Company basically becomes the de facto ruler. And then, exactly 100 years later, boom, the Great Revolt. So, what on earth happened in that century-long gap? What were the policies, the pressures, the slow burn disasters that dismantled a society and drove people to an absolute breaking point? Let's break it down, and we're going to start with the money. First up, the economy. And you have to understand the East India Company's policies, they weren't just about trade. No, this was a complete teardown and rebuild of India's economy, all designed to benefit Britain. And in the process, it systematically wrecked India's traditional way of life, and I mean it hit everyone, from the peasant working the land to the prince in his palace. So let's start at the ground level with the peasant farmer. The company brought in these new land revenue systems with cripplingly high taxes. And get this, you had to pay them in cash, on time, even if there was a drought or a flood. To do that, farmers were forced to take loans from moneylenders at insane interest rates, who were often backed up by the colonial police. It was this vicious, devastating cycle of debt that ended in losing your land. All right, so the farmers are ruined. What about the artisans? For centuries, Indian handicrafts, textiles, metalwork, you name it, were famous across the world. But British policy was like a one-two punch designed to kill this industry. First, they slapped heavy taxes on Indian goods while at the same time flooding the market with cheap, machine-made stuff from Britain. Second, their old customers, the Indian nobles and kings, were losing their own power and wealth. Suddenly, millions of skilled craftspeople had literally no one to sell to and nowhere to go. And you might be thinking, okay, so this was tough on the working class. But it wasn't just them. The traditional elites, the landed aristocracy, people known as zamindars and talukdars, they were systematically wiped out too. Their lands were just taken away. And the scale of this is just staggering. In one region alone, Awadh, which would become a hotbed of the revolt, 21,000 talukdars had their estates confiscated. 21,000. And this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures the sheer despair of this displaced upper class. Think about it. One day you're a respected landowner, and the next, you have no income, no status, no purpose. You're too proud to beg, but you have no other way to survive. This wasn't just an economic blow, it was a deep social humiliation. And it created this large, powerful group of people who had every reason to want the British gone. So you've got this economic disaster unfolding, and right alongside it, you have this total erosion of political power. The East India Company's takeover was basically built on a foundation of lies and broken treaties, and it completely destroyed any trust Indian rulers might have had in them. And a key weapon in their playbook was the infamous doctrine of lapse. Now, for centuries in India, it was a perfectly normal and accepted right for a ruler to adopt an heir if he didn't have a biological son. The British just decided to ignore that. They used this doctrine as a convenient excuse to say, oh, no direct heir? I guess your kingdom is ours now. It was a blatant power grab, and it sent a wave of fear and injustice through all the remaining Indian states. And when you look at all their tactics together, you really see the whole playbook. It was this mix of manipulative deals like the Subsidiary Alliance, which was basically a protection racket, forcing rulers to pay for British troops, and then outright annexation using the doctrine of lapse. Add to that the constant disrespect and humiliation of the Mughal royal family, and you can see why the company was seen as fundamentally dishonest and greedy. Okay, so economic ruin, political betrayal. The third piece of this puzzle is maybe the most personal. It was the growing feeling that Indian society, religion, and the entire way of life were under attack from these foreign rulers who just didn't understand or respect them. Now, look, some of what the British did, like abolishing the practice of sati, they saw as social reform. But from an Indian perspective, it often felt like arrogant outsiders meddling in ancient traditions. And when you combine that with new taxes on temple and mosque lands, or new laws that changed inheritance rules to favor Christian converts, it starts to feel less like reform and more like a deliberate cultural assault. And on top of all that, you had rampant corruption. The local police, the petty officials, the lower courts, they weren't seen as sources of justice, they were seen as instruments of oppression. It created this feeling of absentee sovereignty,
The idea that the people in charge were not only distant and foreign, but that the entire system was fundamentally rigged against you. So you have this giant powder keg of discontent, economic, political, social, just sitting there waiting for a spark. And that spark, ironically, came from within the company's own army. Because the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, weren't some separate, isolated group. They were the very same people we've been talking about, just in a uniform. And this quote right here is the absolute key to understanding the entire revolt. The sepoys felt the exact same pain as the village she came from. The heavy taxes weren't some abstract policy. They were the reason his parents were going hungry. The annexation of land wasn't a political move. It was his family's farm being taken away. So the army didn't just have its own list of complaints. It became the armed voice for the anger of the entire country. And boy, did they have their own specific complaints too. They were paid way less than British soldiers and faced constant racism with pretty much zero chance for promotion. New rules attacked their religious practices, from banning things like beards or caste marks to a new law that meant they could be forced to serve overseas, which was a major religious taboo. And for the many, many sepoys from Awadh, the final insult was watching the British just annex their homeland. And then there was one last crucial piece, a psychological shift. For a long time, the British seemed unbeatable. But word started to spread about their recent struggles, brutal wars in Afghanistan and Punjab, and even news from the Crimean War. For the first time, that myth of British invincibility began to crack. And a new, dangerous idea started to take hold. Wait a minute, maybe these guys can be beaten. So there you have it. You take a century of economic ruin, political humiliation, and deep cultural anxiety, and you concentrate all of that anger inside an army that is a perfect mirror of that society. The revolt of 1857 wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. And while it didn't succeed in throwing the British out, it changed the course of Indian history forever. It was really the beginning of the end of colonial rule. Which leaves us with a pretty big question. The revolt may have failed, but what seeds of a new India did it sow in its wake?